Julian stopped mid-sentence the moment I set the envelope on the table. He had been talking about the new acquisition in Singapore, like the numbers belonged to him. The envelope was the same faded yellow our father used for every important letter he ever wrote by hand. I kept my palm flat on the envelope for 3 full seconds before I lifted it, long enough for Julian to recognize the blue ink that had gone almost gray with age. The 12 board members went quiet at the same time the air conditioning clicked on. Julian's assistant leaned in and whispered something near his ear. He did not turn his head. He kept looking at the envelope the way a man looks at a gun he did not know was loaded. I pulled out the chair at the far end of the table and sat down. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Ethan?" I did not answer him. I looked at Patricia Hale instead. She had been our father's attorney for 31 years. She was the only person in the room who had not looked away. She gave me the smallest nod. It was enough. I opened the envelope and took out the single sheet inside. I placed it face up so the date at the top was visible to everyone. 6 weeks before our father died. 6 weeks before the will Julian had read aloud in the library. Julian stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. He pointed at the paper without touching it. "That is not valid. Everyone here knows the only will that matters was read after the funeral." I finally looked at him. "Then you won't mind if Patricia reads this one out loud." Julian's face had gone the color of the paper. He had not expected me to speak at all. He had expected me to stay quiet the way I had stayed quiet for 18 months. The way I had stayed quiet the afternoon Patricia read the first will in the library of the mansion. Julian had stood by the window the entire time, arms crossed, while she explained that our father had left the company, the house, the accounts, and every share to him. When she finished, Julian thanked her, turned to me, and said the apartment downtown was mine if I wanted it. He said it like he was doing me a favor. Sophie had been sitting on the rug by the fireplace, drawing with her colored pencils. She had not looked up when I picked her up and carried her out. I had signed the papers his lawyers put in front of me because I did not want her to remember her father raising his voice in a room full of strangers. That was the last time Julian had spoken to me directly, until today. Patricia had closed the folder gently, the way she always closed things when she knew the room was about to change. Julian had already moved to the door. He told her he would handle the rest of the arrangements. Then he looked at me for the first time that afternoon and said the apartment on the 14th floor was still in the family name. I could have it. I told him I already had keys to a place. Sophie had drawn a picture of the 3 of us standing in front of the red car our father used to drive. She had given the car 4 doors instead of 2. I folded the drawing and put it in my pocket before we left. Sophie fell asleep on the couch before I finished the 2nd page of her book. I carried her to her room and stood in the doorway longer than I needed to. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a view of the parking garage across the street. It was enough. It had always been enough. But that night, I kept seeing the garage at the mansion. The one Julian had already changed the locks on by the time we got home. The red Ferrari was still under the blue tarp in the far corner. Our father had bought it the year I turned 16. He had let me drive it once on the back roads with the top down, telling me to listen to the engine instead of the radio. Julian had never liked that car. He said it was impractical and expensive to maintain. I had not argued with him then. I was not arguing with him now. I was just going to fix what he had left to rust. The side door was still unlocked. Julian had not thought to change that one yet. The garage smelled like old oil and leather, and the dust that settles on things people stop touching. I pulled the tarp off the Ferrari. The paint had gone dull in patches. Both front tires were flat. I ran my hand along the hood the way our father used to, when he checked for dings after a long drive. Then I opened the trunk. There was nothing inside except a rusted jack and an old blanket that still smelled faintly of his cologne. I closed the trunk. I stood there until the cold from the concrete came up through my shoes, and I went home. Sophie was already awake when I checked on her. She was sitting on the floor in her pajamas, colored pencils spread around her like a small, colorful fence. She was drawing another car. This one was red again. She had added a small figure in the driver's seat and another smaller one beside it. I asked her who was driving. She said it was Grandpa, and the small one was her, and the car was big enough now for all of us. I told her we could go see the real one soon. She asked if Grandpa would be there when we went. I said no. She nodded once, the way she always did when she understood something she did not like, and went back to coloring the wheels. The call came at 7:20 in the morning. It was Julian's lawyer. He said Julian had decided the garage needed to be cleared for storage space. He asked if there was anything I wanted from inside before they changed the remaining locks. I told him the only thing I had wanted was already in my own garage. He asked what that was. I hung up. Sophie was eating cereal at the counter. She asked who had called. I told her it was someone from work. She stirred her spoon in the milk and said she hoped they were nice. I said they were not. She did not ask anything else. I rented a space on the lowest level. The building manager gave me the key and asked what kind of project it was. I told him it was personal. He did not ask again. I had the Ferrari towed there on a flatbed early Saturday morning. Sophie came with me. She sat on a folding chair I brought from the apartment and watched while I loosened the lug nuts on the front wheels. She asked if I was going to make the car run again. I said I was going to try. She asked if Grandpa would have wanted me to. I said I thought he would. She nodded and went back to watching the wheels come off. When both were on the ground, she asked if she could keep one of the old lug nuts. I wiped the grease off it with a rag and gave it to her. She put it in her pocket like it was something valuable. The email arrived from Julian's assistant on a Tuesday afternoon. It was short. Julian wanted the Ferrari returned to the mansion by the end of the week. He said it was part of the estate and I had no right to remove it without permission. I replied with one line. I told her the car had been sitting unused for 3 years and that I would return it when I was finished restoring it. She did not write back. That evening, I stayed in the garage until after midnight. I had already stripped the interior panels and found the old wiring that needed replacing. The work was slow. That was the point. Every bolt I turned was something Julian could not take from me. Every hour I spent with my hands on the car was an hour Sophie did not have to watch her father argue with her uncle about things she was too young to understand. The garage was quiet except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional drip from a pipe overhead. I had the driver's door panel off and laid across 2 sawhorses. The old vinyl had cracked in the sun years ago. I was peeling it back carefully, the way my father had taught me to do anything that mattered. Julian's email from earlier that afternoon was still open on my phone. He had written that I had 48 hours to return the car, or his attorneys would file for replevin. I had not answered. I ran my thumb along the edge of the panel where the adhesive had gone brittle. Underneath, the metal was still solid. That was the part worth keeping. The phone rang while Sophie was pouring milk into her cereal. I let it go to voicemail. Julian's voice came through the speaker anyway. He said he was done being patient. He said the car was not mine to keep, and that I was embarrassing the family by playing mechanic in a public garage. Sophie looked up from her bowl. She asked if Uncle Julian was angry again. I told her he was worried about something that did not belong to him. She stirred her spoon once and said she hoped he found what he was looking for. Then she went back to eating. Sophie climbed into the passenger seat and buckled herself without being asked. She had a new drawing in her backpack. This one showed the red car again, but now there was a second, smaller car beside it. She said the little one was mine. I asked her why she had drawn 2 cars. She said because sometimes people need their own space to fix things. I did not ask who had told her that. On the way home, she asked if we could stop at the hardware store for more sandpaper. I said yes. She smiled at the window the rest of the drive. Robert Lang had been on the board for 22 years. He had been the one who taught both Julian and me how to read a balance sheet when we were still in high school. I had called him that morning and asked if he had time for coffee. He had suggested his office instead. He closed the door behind me and did not sit down right away. He said Julian had been calling board members individually, asking them to sign a statement that the original will was the only one that existed. Robert had not signed it. He looked at me for a long moment and said our father had called him 3 weeks before he died. He had asked Robert whether he thought a man could change what he had built just by signing a piece of paper. Robert had told him no. Our father had hung up without saying anything else. The letter from Julian's attorneys arrived by courier at 6:40. It was 6 pages long and used words like conversion and wrongful detention. Sophie was doing her homework at the coffee table. She looked up when I set the envelope down. I told her it was nothing important. She went back to her math worksheet. I read the letter once, then folded it and put it in the drawer where I kept the spare keys. The language was meant to scare me. It did not. What scared me was how much money Julian was willing to spend to get back a car he had never driven. I worked on the passenger door until the hinges moved without grinding. The interior light still worked when I tested it. I found a small photograph wedged between the seat cushion and the frame. It was the 3 of us at the beach house the summer I turned 14. Julian was already looking away from the camera. Our father had his arm around my shoulders. I put the photo in my wallet and closed the door. The car was starting to look like something again. Not new, just honest. My lead engineer, Marcus Rivera, came into the conference room after the client left. He said the client had asked whether there was any truth to the rumor that I was involved in a family dispute over assets. Marcus had told him it was a private matter. The client had nodded and signed the contract anyway. Marcus waited until the door closed and asked if I needed anything. I told him I needed the revised drawings for the turbine housing by Friday. He nodded and left. I stayed at the table another 10 minutes, looking at the contract. The client had not asked for a discount. He had asked whether I was the same Ethan Vale who used to come to the company Christmas parties with his father. Sophie was already in bed when I went in to say goodnight. She had the rabbit under one arm and the lug nut from the Ferrari on her nightstand. She asked if Uncle Julian was going to take the car away from us. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her the car had never belonged to him. She asked if it belonged to me now. I said it belonged to the person who was willing to fix what was broken. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said she hoped that person was me. I turned off the light and left the door open the way she liked it. The dashboard was out. I had the wiring harness spread across the workbench like a diagram of something that used to work. Patricia Hale called at 1:22. She said Julian had been to her office that afternoon with 2 of his attorneys. He wanted her to draft a new document stating that any item removed from the estate after the funeral was subject to immediate return. She had told him she would review it. Then she asked me how the car was coming along. I told her it was coming. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said our father had once told her that the only thing worth keeping in any inheritance was the part you were willing to repair yourself. She hung up before I could answer. Stepped outside to get air. Julian's black sedan was parked across the street under the broken streetlight. The driver's window was down. I could not see who was inside, but the engine was running. I stood there until the car pulled away. It did not turn on its headlights until it reached the corner. I went back inside and locked the garage door from the inside. The car was not finished, but it was no longer the thing Julian had left to rot. That was enough for tonight. Sophie asked if we could go to the garage after school. She wanted to help sand the dashboard. I told her yes. While she brushed her teeth, I checked the mail slot. There was another envelope from Julian's attorneys. This one was marked Final Notice. I put it in the same drawer without opening it. Sophie came out of the bathroom with toothpaste on her chin. She asked if the car would be ready soon. I said it would be ready when it was ready. She nodded like that was the right answer. The glove box latch had seized. I had already replaced the hinge and the spring, but the latch itself was original and stubborn. I worked a thin blade of metal between the seam and felt something shift that should not have been there. Not wiring, not padding. Something flat and stiff. I stopped. The fluorescent light above me hummed. Sophie's lug nut was still on the workbench where she had left it that afternoon. I set the blade down and stepped back from the car. I told myself it was probably an old registration or a receipt. I told myself I would finish the latch first. Then I picked the blade up again. The panel behind the glove box came out in one piece. Behind it, taped to the metal with old electrical tape that had gone brittle, was a legal-size envelope. The tape had yellowed. The envelope had not been opened. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, were 3 words: "For Ethan only." I did not touch it for a full minute. The garage was cold. My hands were steady. I had come here to fix a car, not to find anything else. I took the envelope out, set it on the workbench next to Sophie's lug nut, and closed the panel again. Then I turned off the lights and drove home. Sophie was still asleep when I called Patricia Hale at 6:50. She answered on the second ring. I told her I had found something in the car and that I needed to see her before Julian's next letter arrived. She asked if it was paper. I said it was. She told me to come to her office at 9 and not to open it. I hung up. Sophie came into the kitchen rubbing her eyes and asked why I was already dressed for work. I told her I had an early meeting. She asked if it was about the car. I said it was about something that had been inside the car. She nodded and poured her own cereal without asking anything else. Patricia closed the door and did not sit behind her desk. She took the envelope from me with both hands and held it up to the light the way she used to check old stock certificates for watermarks. She asked if I had opened it. I said no. She asked if Julian knew. I said I did not think so. She sat down then and opened the envelope with a letter opener she had kept on her desk since I was a boy. She read the first page without speaking. When she reached the second page, she stopped and looked at me over the top of her glasses. She said our father had executed this will 6 weeks before he died and had given it to her with instructions to keep it sealed unless I asked for it. She had never been asked. Until now. She read the rest of it out loud in the same calm voice she had used at the first reading. The company, the house, the accounts, and controlling interest were left to me. Julian was to receive a lifetime income from a separate trust, but no operational control. There was a paragraph at the end in our father's own hand. It said he had watched both of us for the last year of his life and had made his choice based on what he saw when no one thought he was still watching. Patricia folded the pages and put them back in the envelope. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her I needed to think. She said Julian would find out eventually. I said I knew. I picked Sophie up from school early and took her to the park. She ran to the swings while I sat on the bench with the envelope in my coat pocket. A man in a dark suit stood near the entrance for 20 minutes and did not move. When Sophie came back for water, I asked her if she had seen anyone watching us. She said the man by the gate had been there since we arrived. I told her we were going home. She did not ask why. She just took my hand and walked beside me without looking back at the swings. Julian called at 5:40. He did not sound angry this time. He sounded careful. He said he had heard I had taken something out of the car that did not belong to me. He said if I gave it to him now, he would forget about the letters from his attorneys. I asked him what he thought I had taken. He said he did not know yet, but he was willing to make it worth my while to stop whatever I was doing. I told him the car would be finished when it was finished. He hung up. Sophie was drawing at the coffee table. She asked if that was Uncle Julian. I said it was. She asked if he was still mad. I said he was worried. She said worried people sometimes do things they do not mean. I told her that was true. I went back to the car after Sophie was asleep. The dashboard was almost finished. I sat in the driver's seat with the envelope on my lap and read the will again by the light of my phone. The language was simple. There were no conditions. No tests I had to pass. Just a statement that the person who had stayed when it would have been easier to leave was the one who should carry what came next. I put the pages back in the envelope and taped it inside the same panel where I had found it. Not because I was hiding it, because I was not ready to carry it in my pocket yet. Julian's car was parked across the street again when I got home. This time, the driver got out. It was not Julian. It was one of the security men who used to work at the mansion. He walked up to the building entrance but did not come inside. He stood there until I turned on the living room light. Then he got back in the car and drove away. I checked on Sophie. She was asleep with the rabbit under one arm and the lug nut on the pillow beside her. I closed her door halfway and sat on the couch with the lights off until the street outside was quiet again. Marcus Rivera came in at 8:15 with the revised turbine drawings. He said a reporter from the business section had called the front desk, asking whether Vale Precision Engineering was involved in any ongoing litigation with Vale Dynamics. Marcus had told her there was no litigation. The reporter had asked if I was available for comment. Marcus had said no. He put the drawings on my desk and asked if there was anything else I needed. I told him I needed the client list updated by end of day. He nodded and left. I did not open my email. Patricia had already prepared the documents. She said if I wanted to file the will with the court, she could do it tomorrow. She asked if I had decided. I told her I had. I was not going to hide it anymore. She asked what had changed. I said Sophie had started asking questions I could not answer with half-truths. Patricia nodded once and slid the folder across the desk. She said Julian would fight it. I said I knew. She said fighting it in public would mean Sophie would hear things about her grandfather and her uncle that no 7-year-old should have to hear. I said I would tell her myself first. Patricia closed the folder and said she would wait for my call. The process server came while Sophie was still in her pajamas. He handed me the papers without looking at my face and said he was required to wait for a signature. The papers were an emergency motion for temporary possession of the Ferrari and an order barring me from removing any further items from the vehicle. Julian had filed it at 6:45 that morning. Sophie stood in the doorway of her bedroom holding the rabbit. She asked what the man wanted. I told her he was delivering a message from her uncle. She nodded and went back into her room without asking to see the papers. Patricia read the motion twice. She said Julian was trying to force a hearing before I could file the second will. If the judge granted temporary possession, his people could search the car before I had a chance to present anything in court. She asked if the envelope was still in the car. I said it was. She told me to move it somewhere Julian's people would not look. I asked her where that was. She said the safest place was probably still inside the car, because Julian would assume I had already taken it out. I left her office with the motion folded in my coat pocket and drove straight to the garage. I moved the envelope from behind the glove box panel to the inside of the driver's seat cushion. The stitching was already loose from age. I slipped the envelope between the foam and the fabric and sewed it closed again with the same thread I had used to repair the seat. When I finished, the car looked untouched. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time with my hands on the wheel. The garage was empty except for the sound of water dripping somewhere behind the concrete wall. I had come here to fix something that belonged to my father. Now I was hiding the last thing he had left for me inside it. Sophie came home from school quieter than usual. She did not take off her backpack right away. She stood by the door and asked if Uncle Julian was going to take the car today. I told her no one was taking anything today. She asked if the papers the man brought meant we had done something wrong. I sat on the couch and pulled her onto my lap even though she was getting too big for it. I told her the papers were about something that happened before she was born. Between her grandfather and her uncle and me. She leaned her head against my chest and said she did not want Grandpa's car to go away. I told her it was not going anywhere. She stayed there until her breathing evened out. I did not move until she fell asleep. I carried her to bed and pulled the blanket up to her chin, the way my father used to do for me. The lug nut was still on her nightstand. She had drawn a small circle around it with a red crayon so it would not roll off. I turned off the light and stood in the doorway. For the first time since I had found the envelope, I wondered whether keeping it was worth what it was already doing to her. Julian was willing to use courts and process servers and men in dark suits outside our building. He had not yet used her name, but he would if he thought it would make me hand over the envelope. I closed her door and went back to the living room. The motion papers were still on the coffee table where I had left them. My father had been awake that afternoon. The morphine made his voice thin, but his eyes were clear. He had asked me to close the door. Julian had just left. My father said he had been watching Julian for months when he thought no one was looking. He said Julian spoke to the nurses like they were employees he could replace. He said Julian never asked him what he wanted, only what the doctors had said about how much time was left. Then my father looked at me and said he had watched me too. He said I was the one who sat with him when the pain was bad enough that I had to hold his hand so he would not pull the IV out. He said he had already changed the will once. He asked me if I would be willing to carry what he had built, even if it meant carrying Julian's anger with it. I told him I would carry whatever he asked me to carry. He closed his eyes and did not open them again that day. I could not sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights off and listened to the buildings settle. Every few minutes, a car passed on the street below. None of them stopped. I thought about the envelope inside the seat cushion and the motion Julian had filed, and the way Sophie had asked if we had done something wrong. I thought about the hospital room and the way my father's hand had felt in mine when the morphine was not enough. I had told him I would carry it. I had not known then what it would cost Sophie to watch me do it. I stood up and went to the kitchen. I made coffee even though it was the middle of the night. I sat at the table with the mug between my hands until the street outside went quiet again. Marcus Rivera knocked once and came in without waiting for an answer. He said Julian's attorneys had subpoenaed our client list and our financials. He had told them we would respond through counsel. He asked if I wanted him to call Patricia Hale. I told him I would call her myself. He stayed in the doorway for a moment and said the team was asking questions. I told him to tell them the truth, that this was between my brother and me and that it would be settled soon. He nodded and closed the door. I picked up the phone and dialed Patricia before I could change my mind. Patricia listened without interrupting while I told her what I had decided. She said filing the will now would turn the emergency motion into a full hearing on the validity of both documents. She said Julian would try to argue undue influence or that our father was not of sound mind. I told her I was ready for that. She asked about Sophie. I said Sophie had already started asking questions I could not keep answering with half the truth. Patricia closed her notebook and said she would file the will with the court by end of day. She asked if I wanted to be the one to tell Julian or if she should do it through the proper channels. I told her I would tell him myself. I picked Sophie up early again. We sat on the same bench. She did not run to the swings. She stayed beside me and watched a group of older kids play soccer on the far field. After a while, she asked if we were going to have to move again. I told her no. She asked if Uncle Julian was going to keep sending men with papers. I said he might. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she wished Grandpa was still here because he would know what to do. I put my arm around her and told her Grandpa had already done the hardest part. He had decided who should take care of what he built. She leaned into me and did not ask anything else. We sat there until the soccer game ended and the field was empty. I called Julian at 7:10. He answered on the first ring. I told him I had filed the second will with the court and that Patricia Hale would be sending his attorneys the documents by morning. He was silent for several seconds. Then he asked if I really thought a piece of paper written when our father was dying would stand up against the one he had signed when he was still well. I told him the one I had filed was signed 6 weeks before the one he had used. He hung up. Sophie was in her room doing homework. I stood in the hallway outside her door and listened to her pencil moving across the page. I had made the decision. Now I had to live with what it would do to her. The emergency board meeting had been called for 9. Julian was already at the head of the table when I arrived. He had placed the original will in front of him like a shield. Patricia Hale sat to his left with a second folder closed in front of her. 11 board members filled the remaining seats. No one spoke when I walked in. I took the chair at the far end, the same one I had taken the day I placed the envelope on the table. Julian looked at me once, then looked away. Patricia opened her folder. Patricia read the filing date and the case number into the record. She then read the date on the will I had filed. 6 weeks before the will, Julian had presented after the funeral. She placed both documents side by side on the table, so the dates were visible to everyone. Julian's attorney stood and objected on the grounds of timing and capacity. Patricia waited until he finished, then read the handwritten paragraph at the end of my father's will. The room stayed silent while she read it. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at Julian. Julian stood. He said the will I had filed was executed when our father was heavily medicated and not of sound mind. He said any board member who voted to recognize it would be exposing the company to years of litigation. He said he had already spoken to several major shareholders who agreed with him. He looked around the table as he spoke. No one met his eyes for more than a second. When he sat down, Patricia placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was a copy of the letter our father had written to her the week before he died, instructing her to keep the second will sealed until I asked for it. Julian did not touch the paper. Robert Lang spoke first. He said he had known our father for 22 years and had never seen him make a decision out of fear or pressure. He said the letter Patricia had just shown them matched the man he had known. 2 other board members nodded. Julian's attorney tried to speak again. Patricia cut him off and said the question before the board was whether to recognize the will filed by Ethan Vale as the controlling document. She called for a vote by show of hands. Julian did not raise his hand. Everyone else did. Patricia recorded the vote and closed her folder. She said, effective immediately, controlling interest in Vale Dynamics passed to Ethan Vale. She asked if there was any further business. Julian stood again. His voice was lower now. He said this was not over. He said he would challenge the will in court and that the company would be tied up for years. Patricia told him he was free to do so, but until a court ordered otherwise, the board's decision stood. Julian looked at me across the table. I did not look away. He picked up the original will he had brought and walked out. No one followed him. Julian was waiting by the elevators when I came out. His attorney had already left. He told me I had just destroyed everything our father had built. I told him our father had built it twice and had chosen who should carry it the second time. Julian said I would regret this. I said I had already lived through the version where he got everything he wanted. This one could not be worse. The elevator arrived. He stepped inside without looking back. The doors closed. I stayed in the hallway until the light above the elevator went out. The board members were still at the table when I went back in. Robert Lang asked if I wanted to address them. I said I did. I told them I had not come here to take anything from Julian. I had come because our father had asked me to carry what he built, and I was no longer willing to pretend I had not heard him. I said the company would continue to operate as it always had. The only difference was that decisions would now be made by someone who had sat with the man who started it until the end. Robert Lang nodded. No one else spoke. Patricia closed her notebook and said she would prepare the formal notice to shareholders by end of day. I sat in the car with the engine off. The envelope was still sewn inside the driver's seat. I had not moved it. I thought about calling Sophie's school and telling them I would pick her up early. I thought about driving straight to the apartment and telling her that the papers and the men in dark suits were finished. I did not move. I sat with my hands on the wheel the way I had sat in the garage the night I found the envelope. The garage was quiet. For the first time in 18 months, no one was waiting outside to watch where I went next. Patricia had already drafted the press release. She read it to me over the phone. It stated that the board of Vail Dynamics had recognized the will executed by Henry Vail 6 weeks prior to his death, and that operational control had passed to his son Ethan Vail. She asked if I wanted to add anything. I told her to add that Julian Vail would retain his seat on the board pending any further legal proceedings. She paused. Then she said that was generous. I told her it was not generosity. It was what our father would have done. She said she would send the release at 4. Sophie was already home when I walked in. She had her backpack on the floor and was sitting on the couch with the rabbit in her lap. She asked if the meeting was over. I told her it was. She asked if Uncle Julian was still mad. I sat beside her and said he was, but that he would not be sending any more papers for a while. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked if Grandpa would be proud of what I had done. I told her Grandpa had already told me what he wanted. She leaned against my side and stayed there until it was time to make dinner. Neither of us turned on the television. The press release would be public by morning. Tonight was still ours. The office had been my father's. Julian had cleared it out the week after the funeral and turned it into a conference room no one used. I had the long table removed and the desk brought back from storage. The chair still smelled faintly of the leather conditioner my father used. I sat behind it and opened the first file Marcus Rivera had left for me. It was the turbine housing project I'd been working on in my own firm before any of this began. The numbers were the same, only the letterhead had changed. Julian came in through the side entrance at 9:15. He was not wearing a suit. He carried a cardboard box with a few personal items that had still been in his old office. 2 security guards walked behind him at a respectful distance. He did not look at the reception desk. He did not look at the portrait of our father that still hung above the marble. He walked straight to the elevators, pressed the button, and waited. When the doors opened, he stepped inside without turning around. The guards did not follow him in. The doors closed. I watched from the mezzanine until the light above the elevator went dark. Sophie helped me finish the last of the interior panels. She held the flashlight while I tightened the final screws on the glove box. The car still needed paint and new tires, but the engine turned over when I connected the battery. We sat in the front seats with the doors open and listened to it idle. Sophie asked if we could take it to the beach house someday. I told her we could. She asked if Grandpa would have liked the way it sounded now. I told her he would have said it sounded like something worth keeping. She turned off the flashlight and leaned her head against the seat. We stayed there until the engine warmed and the garage no longer felt cold. Sophie fell asleep on the couch again. I carried her to bed and left the door open the way she liked. The lug nut was back on her nightstand, polished now because she had asked me to clean it. I went back to the living room and turned off the lights. The press release had gone out at 4. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Julian would fight it in court. He would lose. The company would keep running. Sophie would go to school and draw more cars, and eventually stop asking why her uncle no longer called. I sat in the dark and listened to the buildings settle around me. For the first time since my father died, the quiet did not feel like something I had to guard against. Sophie came into the kitchen already dressed for school. She poured her own cereal and sat across from me at the small table. She asked if today was a normal day. I told her it was. She asked if I would still pick her up at 3:15. I told her I would. She stirred her spoon in the milk, and said she was glad the car was almost finished. I asked her why. She said because now it could stay with us instead of going back to a garage where no one drove it. I told her that was exactly why I had fixed it. She nodded and finished her cereal without saying anything else. When she left for school, she did not look back at the apartment door the way she used to. The first board meeting under the new structure was short. I sat at the head of the table. Robert Lang sat to my right. Patricia Hale had joined the board as an independent director at my request. We approved the quarterly projections, confirmed the turbine project budget, and set the date for the annual shareholder meeting. No one mentioned Julian's name. When the meeting ended, Robert stayed behind. He said my father would have been proud of how little I had changed. I told him I had not come here to change the company. I had come here to keep it from being changed by someone who had never understood what it was for. Robert nodded and left. I stayed at the table until the room was empty. Sophie and I went to the park after lunch. She ran to the swings this time. I sat on the same bench and watched her go higher than she had gone the last time we were here. A man in a dark suit stood near the entrance for a few minutes, then turned and walked away. I did not recognize him. He did not come back. Sophie called my name from the top of the swing and waved. I waved back. The envelope was no longer in the car. It was in the safe in my new office, where it belonged. The car was in the garage downstairs, waiting for the paint and the tires and the first drive we would take together when the weather turned warm. Some men spend their lives trying to own what their fathers built. Others spend their lives trying to deserve it. The difference is not in the size of the empire. It is in the hours you are willing to spend with your hands on something broken until it runs again. Drop a like if this one hit different. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next one.